Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Merci.
So hello everybody. Thank you to everybody who is here, but thank you to everybody who is following us online. So we're going to start this panel discussion on the subject, looking for the great European novel, with three people plus one, who I will introduce in just a while. So before that, let me just say a few words about why we are together today, what we're going to try and talk about over the course of the next hour, before we open up to questions from the floor. So starting with something that seems obvious is never easy. When I say this, if you know, we look for something that is supposed to be a great European novel, like the Americans refer to their great American novels, we're trying to think about what might make up something that imposes itself on readers, on society, and on culture. The Americans have managed that, and the editorial market, the publishing market, and Anglo-Saxon literature generally has managed that. Just look at the fact that the expression, the great American novel, you know, it has a Wikipedia page, a very full Wikipedia page where lots of different works are listed, these works that make up the American cultural heritage. So, and we recognize those works as great American novels because the type of fiction, because of their very nature, they seem to capture something that reflects the imagination, a political aspect, cultural, linguistic dimensions at a given point in time. So the question is, when we try and transpose this challenge at a European level, the question is different. What is the right scale for the great novel of a cultural area when it's not just in one language, but in a network of languages? Umberto Eco says that translation is the language of Europe. But what about the concrete choices? Which works, which novels are going to be read with as much interest in Warsaw, Madrid, Rome, or other European countries? So I'm going to hand over the floor to our speakers because I'm just the moderator. We'll try and introduce different thoughts, different ideas about this question. So before that, let me just tell you why we are here today. Because all four of us are linked. Marlena, Wilczak, Felix Terones, and Mathieu. And you all have something that we share. Your literary correspondence for the Grand Continent, of which I am the editing manager. And every month, in 12 or so languages, you put forward literary selections that give us a panorama of what appears to be, not just in our own country, but in all languages, you know, gives us an idea of what is out there at continental level. You know, we've got what we have in our country. You know, there are our knowledge of two or three novels that are important. So we've been publishing once a month a literary selection and reports on certain works. So let us go straight to the heart of the matter then. I'll start by asking each of you more or less the same question so that you can introduce yourselves. And the question is, tell us in a few words or in a few minutes what the basic trend is that seems to represent your linguistic era today. And I think that will lead to a more constructive discussion and maybe a more theoretical discussion about what we might refer to as a great European novel today. Marlene Wilczak, I'll start with you. You're just next to me. You're a PhD student at the Sorbonne University and Warsaw University, and you're working on the archives of Olga Boznanska, as well as the anthropology of writing and textual genetics. You have the floor. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to apologize for my French, which is not without errors. So I am Polish. So I'll start with a trend that is not surprising. It's inspired by the work of Olga Koczarczuk, who had the Nobel Prize for Literature for his poetic imagination, but also for his prose. It's characterized by a look, by its interior outlook, but also its tenderness towards the world. This first trend, this first literary trend, shows us that there is proximity with nature. So there's a focus between human and non-human beings and their relationship with the environment. A good example of this trend is a novel. I want to give you a concrete example. It's a novel by Julia Ferdortuk called Under the Sun. It's a novel that's also inspired by the trend of eco-poets. So this is a literary trend that has emerged from the environmental crisis. So new texts have been formed from this crisis. These texts highlight the role of the human being in the natural world. So this writer also draws from the ecclesiastics. The conviction is that life is instead of thinking that life is full of suffering, the writer integrates her characters into natural surroundings. It's the story of a couple. Ferdortuk shows us that the environment is made up of a plurality of points of view. So that's the first trend, inspired by Olga Tokarczuk. And the second trend that we can see in Polish literature is self-fiction. And we can say that in Polish literature today, there are different types of self-fiction. The first is rooted in history, and the second reflects individual, intimate, private stories. So the first trend is based on difficult memories, family memories, memories of war. Magdalena Tuni is a good example. Her novel Shum, I think it's called Sound Pollution in French. Magdalena Tuni, Annalise, talks about post-war trauma. The main character, the narrator, is a little girl who at the same time is an author herself. As far as the second type is concerned, where there's more of an intimate focus, let me give you some examples. There's an incredible novel called in Polish Bezmatic. Bezmatic is a revenge, and it's a novel about the experience of the death of a mother. It's about an orphan. It's also a novel about the relationship between a daughter and a mother, generally speaking. Another example is the journal of a Polish actor. He writes a confession. The author is homosexual and a member of the intellectual elite. He comes from a family without any cultural capital, to say things simply. And the third trend, which is entirely new, perhaps it's a fashion, but I find it very interesting, this new trend. And it concerns judgment about the condition of farmers' lives and the violence exercised by lords in the past, so seigneurial rights. So there's a Radikrak in Poland who wrote a novel about the story of Jakub Schiller, who is the director of the peasant revolt in the 17th century against nobility, against the violence practiced by nobility, members of the nobility. So this trend can be observed not only in literature, but also in history. And in 2020, a historical synthesis was published. It was called The Popular History of Poland. And just 2 months ago, another book by Caspar Burger, who is an anthropologist, called Hamsterfall, which designates vulgarity. But it's also an old word to talk about a man that is to be thought about negatively, for example, the peasant. So the Polish landscape sees a new light being shed on the slavery of peasants, violence, and committed against peasants. But let me stop there, perhaps. Thank you. Thank you very much. I was going to say, without further ado, we'll carry on. But let me just mention that among the themes that you've evoked, and perhaps this might be a good subject for discussion later on, some themes are linked to other linguistic eras. Some are especially linked to Poland. I'm thinking of the last theme that you mentioned. But for those of you listening to us, let me just point out that the starting point of your explanation, I was going to say that you know, the different poetic streams by Oveto Garczuk, who had the Nobel Prize for Literature not long ago. You do a very good analysis of this writer in the Grand Continent Review. You refer to it as the time of the narrator. Let us move on to Félix Terronès, who's a critic and translator. He's Peruvian, and he's going to talk to us about Spanish literature. You're a lecturer at the university in Bern, and you're the author of a thesis on images and the imagination of bordellos in Latino American literature. This was published in 2019 with a preface in Spanish called Un sueño o su ficción. So you have the floor. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you for inviting me to this discussion where we're going to talk about great European novels. You were talking about the diversity of languages in Europe. We can draw a parallel, and you drew a parallel with American novels. In Northern America, they've only got one language, and that is English, whereas in Europe, there are many different languages. I could say the same about Spain, because unlike what we have in France, where there was a movement to Frenchify the whole population, in Spain, we've got a lot of different linguistic differences in Spain. There's Valencian, Basque, Storia, and of course Catalan and Spanish. So there's something that comes out of this diversity. In Spain, when we think about Spain, we think about two main linguistic, cultural, literary, political, and sports centers, Madrid on one hand and Barcelona on the other hand. So when we talk about contemporary literature in Spain, there's this centralism that comes out. That's one of the specific aspects of Spain. So Madrid is the capital. It's been the capital for centuries. So we can find it's very literary in Madrid. You've got Cervantes and many other authors who came from Madrid later on. And I'm not just thinking about the 20th century. There were other European figures come in. José Silla, who's the Nobel Prize winner for literature, and Francis Combal. They both looked at representing cities through novels. So Barcelona is quite a different capital. Barcelona is a European capital. Before being a Spanish capital, it was a European capital. We speak Catalan and Spanish, and you can also find houses that really contributed to what was called, as of the 70s, the boom in Latino American literature. So it was a boom that made it possible to have a kind of a Mediterranean European focus, but also an American focus, which is actually quite important. So we're talking about a country that is rich, that is highly heterogeneous, and that entered the European Union in 1986. So the Spanish literature, in other words, in the 90s, was, in my opinion, literature that tried to set up a European dimension. I'm thinking about Antonio Muñoz Molina. So his novels focus on Lisbon and other European cities, but I'm also thinking about another writer whose books have been published, Javier Marias. Javier Marias is a writer from Madrid, and his novels take place in cities like London. And he's shown a kind of cosmopolitan aspect of Spanish literature, not necessarily through spaces, but also through his esteem. When Spanish writers from the previous generation, unlike those, he claims that there is a universal language, Vladimir Novikov and others. And he also talks about William Faulkner. It's a Spain with a new focus compared with the previous millennium and compared with the 21st century. These authors try and be more cosmopolitan in their outlook. They try and show that they know what's happening elsewhere in the world. So this is that was a generation that we refer to as a Nocilla generation. They want to show things differently. There's a kind of an other aspect that is focused on. Philosophy and fiction are included. They show how the popular culture, mass media, and new technologies such as virtual reality, internet, how they've really kind of infiltrated everyday life, and how they've penetrated art, generally speaking. In 2008, there was a focus on immigration. This brings me back to what you were saying, Marlène. So there are three links with politics and history. And think about Javier Cercas or Isa Rosa, who looked at the dictatorship period, the increase in Franquism in Spain. They question Spanish historic memory through fiction. They have historical reflections and that they deal with. In my opinion, this concern, we're talking about niches on the market. They're conscious of this. Isa Rosa recently published a novel whose title is, in Spanish, in the text, in other words, a novel about the Civil War. That's what it translates into in English. So going back to politics, so the increase in the right-hand movement and the colonial and imperial history past is also something that's treated. Evia Roca, for example, wrote an essay that was very much circulated in Spain and elsewhere with a name that is in Spanish. So it was about the empire. And he underlined the positive aspects of the arrival of Spaniards in the United States, civilization, religion, language, but he also criticizes uncertain historiography of the Spanish colonial period. Evia Roca had a link with French academics, so there's a lot of reflection about this then. What about the role of national literature? What about the place for national literature, given the global context where we talk about world literature? So in a global text, where national texts seem to be overtaken by the global level, this is a very interesting question, I believe. I believe that in the Spanish dictatorship, it's during this moment that immigration is international, where you get these migrants who talk about unemployment, who talk about the political crisis. These writers are migrants. They're not only Latin Americans, but they're also Africans, and they come from other latitudes as well. In world literature, we've created a term for this. We refer to it as migrant literature. It's a term that needs to be questioned as well. You know, we need to have a critical approach to this term, but it intrigues me because all of these writers that come from other latitudes contribute to the great European novels of today. I'll stop there with that question, which you might like to talk about later on.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. So I'll hand over the microphone to Vincenzo Latronico straight away, so that we can continue this overview of European literature. We only represent 3 languages, but it's already quite a lot, to have a good discussion. But Vincenzo is Italian, and I think he's speaking to us from Berlin. Vincenzo, you're an author and a translator in Italian, towards Italian. You're the author of many novels, including the last one, La Cospirazione delle Colombe, was published by Bompiani in 2011. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. What you've said is very interesting. I'd just like to start by talking about something that was said by Felix. Sorry, I'll try. The video is blocked. I'd like to talk about the fact that, to a certain extent, national novels have been overtaken by the global dimension. I'd like to focus on this term, overtaken, from the point of view that I see. My point of view is I use something that's a bit stronger and connotations that are not as positive. In other words, There's a Japanese book that was published 10 years, The Fall of a Language in the Age of English. It's a book that thinks a lot about that in the Japanese experience, somebody who's grown in the United States and who decided to go back to his original language and culture by going to live in Japan and writing in Japanese. Now that that person is older, they have regrets because they feel that they are put to one side, that they are ignored in terms of international literature or global literature. So what this person says, and it's good to talk about that today, is that it's not that the national level has been overtaken by the global level. It's that the national level, the national literature has had to become local. It's been put to one side by something that is more universal or that claims to be more universal. And whatever claims to be universal to a certain extent is. And English-speaking literature, we talk about the great American novel, as you said, and we know that to a certain extent we all are faced with this. We're not writing in English, and we're not sure that there'll ever be a great Japanese novel or a great Italian novel. We don't even know what that might be, a great European novel. So what I wanted to talk about in relation to the Italian situation today is what I see. There's a trend, a commercial trend. This can be seen in the works of great literature and great cinema. It's a tendency to claim this kind of local niche. If we take about the huge impact that if we look at the success of Elena Ferrante, who writes great novels, her great novels have been seen as great novels because there was this very local dimension. There was a kind of a postcard of certain parts of Italy provided. Naples, the movements in the 60s and 70s that could be recognized immediately by readers. And that could also kind of be seductive, have a certain Italian flair, but at the same time a universal dimension. There's another writer, Nino, who experienced a kind of access to this more universal dimension, thanks to the fact that he focused on the narration of Italy in its very local dimension. And I believe, I fear that you've got these two examples, and they've had a very big impact in Italian culture. And I believe that there are many authors and authoresses who are focusing on this local dimension so that they have a more immediate appeal, so that they reach out to a more international public, because they're a little bit afraid of not being able to access this public by representing university. Anchele Gioia wrote a lovely novel. He mentioned the title in Italian, which it was a novel that was published last year, and that this author tried to give a very somber image, a very typically cruel image of Rome. Camadora and Camamurgia. It's true as well, but there again the focus is on another region. As an Italian writer and living in Berlin, I feel more European than Italian in many respects. And it makes me afraid to talk about world literature, this global market, this global literature that we hear about. I have the feeling that it's very, easy to be in a niche where, each country offers its typical product, and then, or a language, because there's a more immediate access to universality.
So I think the only other trend that I pronounce trend in Italy at the moment, which contrasts with this, is a trend towards autobiographical narration, which over the past 2 years has produced 2 great books. La Straniera by Claudia and Marta Marrone. Both, I think, will be translated into French, which are literary reworkings of part of the author's personal experiences, very different but very impactful in their own ways. And this, for example, I think is a very good direction, a very fertile direction for a new generation of writers in Italy. Of course, we could also say, and this is something which I find significant, regarding a generation of writers of between the late 20s, 30s and 40s, like these 2 authors, is that this trend towards a certain sort of autobiographic narrative was also imported by the big success of this kind in the English-speaking world, and Claudia and Marta Marrone and myself, and almost all the other authors of this generation are living partly of translations from English, and there is therefore a way in which even Italian literature, which isn't focused on doing something really local, tends to have this universality, which is mediated and in a certain way inherited from the things coming from the English-speaking world and from what's going on in New York or elsewhere. So I think I will stop there. Thank you very much. So with these considerations, which are perhaps less optimistic, or which do raise the problem that we may have, which is what does European mean when the natural scale of any literature is its language, or the area in which its language is spoken? And is this a challenge which is worth taking up, as Plato might have said, to find a level which is no longer that of the national language or something local, that, like what Vincenzo mentioned, which has its limits for international readers, but not directly on a worldwide scale, on a global scale. So this intermediate level, continental level, let's say, which might be at this European level. So to go into this question, I'm going to suggest to give you, if we look back, I said at the beginning that there were no doubt some great American novels, but have there not been some great novels in Europe? Because what we have difficulty finding today here might have existed in the past if we look 100 years ago. Into your eyes, can there be any doubt that Kafka, Woolf, Dostoevsky, Proust are authors of great European novels? And what is it that was there at that time which might not be there anymore now? What are the points that we could perhaps find there as a reference for today's literature? I don't know who would like to answer that. We'll perhaps begin with Vincenzo, who isn't actually with us. In fact, I think that the answer is yes and no. There is a way in which Dostoevsky, Kafka, Virginia Woolf, Mary Ortiz have written or wrote great novels. There is no doubt about that, and they are European. We can name their works as being great European novels, but there is a way in which this is not the case, which is that there is an element of identity which comes from the great American novels that they offer their natural readers, the American reader, readers in the US, who find a sort of direct figuration of their experience that I, as an Italian, I'm not going to find in Dostoevsky, but I'm not going to find in Balzac, even if we can say that La Comédie Humaine is the perfect example of the great something novel. Of course, we find ourselves in there in a way, in a spiritual way. We understand what it means to be a human being, which is what literature is supposed to do. But there's a sort of direct access to this experience, which is only possible when we have this unity of social existence, which we don't have in Europe today, even leaving aside the language question. And I think that is what shows, which counters, which is difficult for this notion of the great French or American or whatever novel. We can talk about a great novel which is linked with a political, civil or social unit, and that unit should be as broad as possible, like the English-speaking world, which covers a large part of the world. But this idea of this social and civil unity isn't, I think, the case. It doesn't make La Comédie Humaine a great novel of that kind. And the same thing could be said of Musil. So in these cases, what I wonder is this what we really want in Europe? Or do we want to have an approach which allows a more multiple, plural way without some sort of ranking with the great rankings at the top and then a huge population of little novels at the bottom? Thank you very much. Would one of you like to answer that argument, this slightly deconstructionist argument regarding these geographic and social areas? What I see in Poland is a tendency towards micro-narratives, micro-novels, where there is no attempt to write a great novel at all, or even let alone a great European novel. What springs to mind when I'm listening to Vincenzo is that Proust, Kafka, Thomas Mann, the great names of European literature, all of them tried to answer the questions about beauty, truth, art, the great questions raised in Europe, and perhaps to answer this, deconstructionist vision could be to say this is perhaps we could look for universal questions for our geographic areas, the great issues, and try to answer those questions. Yeah, I'm delighted to be taking part in this debate, because I've noticed there's lots of ideas, lots of things coming up which strike me a lot. It's a very rich discussion to have, interesting to have this opportunity. But what Vincenzo said struck me, and also Marlena. I think it's true that what makes the singularity of European literature and novels is that there is this notion of circulation of, when we talk about world literature, and I think Vincenzo defined very well the challenges of world literature, which is a term that comes from the United States. So it comes through the United States and then gets labeled as being universal. So what bothers me is that this exacerbated localism, to come back to a term used by Vincenzo, is the fact of writing on very limited themes, the Spanish Civil War, for example, with a language which is extremely smooth. We have to have a style and a language which is very, very neutral, the most translatable possible. And that's something which strikes me very much, because that's not the European novel. We talked earlier about Thomas Mann, about Proust, or Dostoevsky. These are writers who didn't write to be European. They wrote to be writers, not to be European, and they wrote with a very modern approach. So I think very sincerely that the European novel and European literature are looking to the past. For me, there are authors who have a European, on the European scale. There's Dante in the Renaissance, there's the Spanish novel. We can't, the Spanish novel would not be what it is today without Cervantes. And this was a sort of, it was, and he took a European theme but wrote a very, very Spanish novel. So he has that wish to really go further. And I think that today the problem is this circulation of literature, and it's seen as a way for writers to cross borders, to be read across borders. That's what the writer wants to do. He doesn't write just for a small group of people around him. He wants to have readers. He wants to have a broad readership. But at the same time, but if we write in a style which is totally interchangeable, writers often write today with a style which is neutral. We no longer recognize a voice in there. And I think that's perhaps something Vincenzo was sounding pessimistic earlier. Perhaps I'm sounding even more pessimistic now myself. But we need to speak, we need to express ourselves. And when we talk about the great American novel, but Cervantes wrote a great novel and he is European. So I think we have so many books, such a wealth in this European scope. So in these novels, there's always this desire to reach out further, and I think that's the whole point of literature. To come back to what you all said, I'll perhaps ask a question a little differently. First of all, do we need... Everything you're saying tends to show also that it's not necessarily by intentional efforts in writing that literary symbols emerges afterwards when a society recognizes itself in a book and makes an author's work and establishes an author's work. So in fact, should we be heading in an opposite direction? Do we not need if we want a European or to be a transnational or European symbol, a narrative form doesn't need to be long. Thinking perhaps of Marlena with Olga Tokarczuk, who is a writer who goes against what you've been saying, relatively complex. and writing relatively long cycles of works compared to the other trends we're seeing today in literature. I think it's also a question of the demands of the market, the needs of the readers. Olga Tokarczuk, as you say, writes long novels about complex subjects. Like, I don't know if you're familiar with her book for which she received the Booker Prize, the Book of Jacob, a novel
sur la religion juive.
About the Jewish confession and in Poland, and it's really very elaborate. She did a lot of research for the book, historic research, and I do wonder whether this question of the paradox of the local and the universal, I do wonder if, for example, the books of this book by Tokarczuk is in many ways very local. It's of interest to European readers at the same time. So I don't know. But if we're talking about the form of the novel, that's something I also was thinking about before our discussion, because yes, there are great novels with a very long, linear narrative construction, and that for me is a question which is very important, if whether the European novel should be a big linear narrative about history, or whether it shouldn't rather take the time to look for the subject in the history or the stories of the minorities, and perhaps open up the debate to have literature written by minorities, to hear their voices, to integrate them into this history of Europe, which is a history of violence, colonization, and all sorts of things. Thank you very much. And unless you have an immediate answer, I'll ask the question a little bit differently again, to try to ask you as many questions as I can in as short a period as possible. Could we not perhaps put out the challenge that in Europe, that localism, the localism Vincenzo was afraid of or was worrying about, might be overcome when it's in the European space, so that when we play the local card, this, as you said, can produce a sort of picture postcard to the eyes of an Australian, Japanese or American reader reading Elena Ferrante. But is it not in this European space that when something very local is produced in another country, we do realize that it does also speak to us, thinking about subjects of auto-fiction or true fiction, which is a trend that you have all mentioned in your respective areas, and we know how present it also is in French-speaking literature, like in Arnaud or Emmanuel Carrère, in different styles that correspond to the sort of autofiction that Marlene mentioned, novels about ourselves and historic novels, true novels about ourselves and about history. So in a way, this trap between the local and the general, and perhaps getting lost in the local dimension, cannot be overcome when we write a novel which might write about Madrid, but which speaks, which is evocative for somebody reading it in Romania or in Estonia. In fact, I'll answer, but I'd also like to link it in with something Felix said, because I think, obviously, Europe is in an ambiguous position for this situation between the global and the local. And the solution is a sort of multi-locality. Felix was talking about reaching across borders, and that is exactly it, the experience of a writer or a philosopher in Europe, and it has been like that for centuries, has been to reach out across borders, to learn other languages, to exchange with others. And I think that if there is a European specificity, it lies in that multiplicity. And while Felix was speaking about this, I was thinking about it. If we have to think about a prototype European novel, even if it's anything but great, or if only because it's very short, is Kentucky by Samantha Schweblin, who is a writer from Argentina, writing in Spanish, who lives in Berlin. I don't know if that counts as European, but it's a story that happens all over the world, in South America, in Italy, in Hong Kong. And it doesn't really belong to any local tradition. But of course, it's local in many ways, because I think that Samantha Schweblin lives somewhere near where I do, in Berlin. And I think that that could be a good example of something trying to reach beyond that opposition. Yeah, I was interested that you mentioned that she has lived in Argentina. I'm less familiar with her as an author, but it brings me back to what I said at the beginning of my presentation. With European literature, increasingly is for people who come there from other backgrounds, other horizons, people who weren't necessarily born within the borders of Europe, but who come from other places, linguistically and culturally and aesthetically, to bring something new and to enrich Europe. Vincenzo talked about an Argentinian writer. There's David Yarmani, the Iranian writer, who reads Hölderlin. But it's somebody who is whose creativity is very hybrid, who perceives literature as something which mixes and blends, and which is open to thinking. We have these migrant writers who are producing European literature for today. And I think this emphasizes the universality of Europe in the good sense of the word, leaving aside all the historic questions and of the colonies and all the rest, and in another way, emphasizing what has gone on in European history since the fall of the Berlin Wall. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the fall of an ideological and spatial border, and that leaves a scar. And what are we going to do with those scars in Europe? How are we going to build our fiction, our new representations, our new literary representations through novels? So I think this is something which we do need to think about. Alina? It's a shame that we don't have a German correspondent here, but it's true. It's a good question. For me, I understand that well, because I come from the other side of the Berlin Wall, Warsaw, as you are well aware.
l'impression que Varsovie devient
And I have the impression that Warsaw is becoming more and more cosmopolitan as a city, and the same applies to the other large Polish cities. But in terms of literature,
c'est très local.
the subjects remain very local, and it's very interesting because today there are a lot of autobiographical narratives about the economic transformation and capitalism in Poland, because it came as a shock for people.
Oui, c'est une bonne question.
So that's a good question of how we can unite the two views from each side of the Berlin Wall. And on the subject of this hybridization and these migrant authors, we also see that there are people who have formed figures that have formed national literature by being born. They're like Ishiguro, Nabokov, who are European writers, very much European writers, even if they aren't from here originally. And that applies perhaps more to the Spanish-speaking world, but Malina and Vincenzo may have your views as well. But how does, you talk about Spanish literature being bipolar between Barcelona and Madrid? Don't worry, we can have a few extra minutes. But how does the view of Europe work from a language which is a literary language throughout the South American continent? Is it not by taking a step back that we become aware of the specifics of our continent? Is it not perhaps from a Latin American literature that we understand what a European novel could be? Yeah, absolutely. I agree entirely with what you're suggesting. It makes me think of a book published in the 1980s called Spanish Authors in the Latin American World. So talking about very prominent Spanish writers like Francisco Umbral, and we asked them for their view of Latin American literature, and it was very evident. Or Antonio Molina, who as readers of literature, we're not familiar with the borders. It's a question of imagination, the links we create, and literary creation. Everything is possible. Molina read Juan Carlos Onetti, a Uruguayan writer, and that enabled him to create his own literary world, which was very literary, very European, very Spanish. Of course, there are other Spanish writers who have a more mixed or negative view of the Latin American novel, but it's a mirror that's there from across the Atlantic, and which enables them to look at themselves, perhaps not in a navel-gazing way, but with a critical view, which means that the Spanish writers can draw on this. And the greatest Spanish language writer of the 20th century was Borges, who was not Spanish. And after Borges, we had a different view of Spanish language literature, and it provided a different way of doing literature for Spanish writers.
Marlena Vincenzo, would you like to add anything to that? I'm turning round to see Vincenzo. No, the only thing that I can add, I'm not going to read it because it's too pessimistic. So we were talking about the addition, so that, you know, the search later on. There was a preface by somebody who said, "This life is killing me." Now, what is the nature of Latin American literature? This is really what we're trying to talk about now. I just wanted to cite the end of his introduction, but it's so pessimistic that I'm not going to do it. So you can look it up, maybe. My point of view is not as negative as that. Even some of the ideas of Bolaños in his text, I understand them. Marlene, I have nothing to add. So we don't want to go over too far. Are there any questions in the floor? Thank you. This was very interesting. I had a question. Perhaps you can tell me that Romain Garé's novel is called European Education. But why is it called European Education? We're talking about Romain Gary, a migrant writer who came to Europe during his youth. So that's my first question. And linked to that, we've been talking about this great novel or great narrative. In the history of philosophy, this makes me think of Hegel, who, through his work, tried to produce a great narrative, but a narrative of humanity, more broadly speaking. It was a narrative that claimed to reach the end of history and that the reabsorption of humanity in the concept with an absolute quest. You can see traces of this in, great nationalistic narratives. I'm thinking about Germany under the Third Reich. So there was the idea that there was a narrative that was supposed to be universal, and with all of the consequences that that entails. So if we take a novel like the European Education by Romain Gary, perhaps across Europe after the World War, we've not got a refusal to cede to this call for something that's absolute. It's denying otherness by reducing it to an overly determined concept. So that's not the story of, that's not the great European narrative. And that's what I wanted to say, the link with otherness. Who feels that they have what it takes to answer that question? It opens up some more optimistic horizons, let's say, than some of the other comments. Well, just to go back to what you said, Marlene, I think we could perhaps set up some kind of transition here. It's what you were underlining, Marlene, that we're not in the same period. We're no longer in the period of great narratives. We've got smaller narratives, broken up narratives, and I'm referring to Spanish literature. But if we talk about new subjectivities, short texts, factual texts that are broken up, that don't offer some kind of unity, ideological or aesthetic unity, or texts with the subjectivity. I read Romain Gary with a lot of fascination, and I have a great memory of that. I like thinking of that text. We're talking about an immigrant writing in French, and we're talking about extraterritorial writers. This is what we're talking about, extraterritoriality. Writers who come from another linguistic world and who choose to write in a different language. For example, in English, Conrad, who chose to write in English, Roman Gary, who chose to write in French. So I think that the epoch is not the same. So the fiction is not dogmatic. The Roman Gary was a philosopher, a novelist, who also had there was another writer like that, Jean-Paul Sartre, who was very much engaged. He said that a writer should be a man of his times. So these are writers' paradigms, aren't they? Perhaps they're a little bit old-fashioned now. Marlena, do you have a reaction? Yes, perhaps. Yes, I think we're not living in the same times. There have been lots of philosophical schools that talk about otherness, transhumanism, and then other literary practices that I referred to at the start. So, the way you take into account nature, animals, what I was referring to, nature, generally speaking, a river. Yes. So I think it's a good reflection, a kind of a total narrative linked to otherness. I don't think that's what we need now. Vincenzo, would you like to add one last thing? No? No, I agree. Well, if there are no other questions, I think we will sign off and stop there. Thank you very much for your participation. Thank you for your participation in Berlin, and thank you for that very enriching discussion. I'm sure there will be other things written on these subjects, or at least discussed. There will be other discussions. Thank you.